Good morning, and welcome to our Zoom worship service. I am Fran Rodriguez, and I'm part of our church's Racial Justice Book Group, which brings you today's service. I'd like to begin by reading a few words written by Langston Hughes in the 1920s, someone who was around before civil rights movement, and his words encapsulate all the things that I feel I have learned so far in this group. There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings, freedom sings all day, every day. There are words like liberty that almost make me cry. If you had known what I knew, you would know why. We preface our service by acknowledging that the land on which our homes and our church were built was not uninhabited when European settlers arrived here with their ideas of conquest and ownership. For those of us who live in Moscow, Pullman, or other nearby communities, we live on the ancestral homelands of the Nimipu, called Nez Perce by the French-speaking traders, the Palouse and the Shitshunch, called the Coeur d'Alene. If you are joining us from another place, I encourage you to discover who inhabited or move through the place where you now live in the times before colonization and genocide, and where they are now. We pause and remember that we live on ground that is sacred, ground that was once stolen, ground that cries out for justice and responsible stewardship. May our remembering help us and find the courage to do our part to restore to wholeness the earth and all its peoples. And now let's join our voices together for our words of welcome, unison chalice lighting, and sung affirmation. Whomever you are, wherever you've come from, whatever your beliefs, whomever you love, and however bumpy your life's journey, know that you are welcome here. We are hoping that everyone here has a chalice or candle to light and something to light it with. Let's light our chalices together.
Hello from the Gibbler family, Marissa, Avi, and Loie. In the light of truth and the warmth of love, we gather to seek and seek to share.
From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and love arise. Let beauty, truth, and good be sung in every land by every tongue.
Hello, I'm Kimberly Green, also a member of the Racial Justice Book Group. Today, we hope to show how literature teaches us and leads us, helps us to better understand other people. Poetry especially is the distilled words of another human, and today's opening words come from Mexican-American poet Ada Limon. Her poem is called New American Anthem. Oh, sorry, I just lost my script. Okay. The truth is, I've never cared for the national anthem. If you think about it, it's not a good song, too high for the most of us, with the rocket's red glare. And then there are the bombs. Always, always, there's war and bombs. Once I sang it at homecoming and threw off even the tenacious high school band off key. But the song didn't mean anything. Just a call to the field, something to get through before the pummeling of youth. And what of the stanzas we never sang? The third one that mentions no refuge could save the hireling and the slave. Perhaps the truth is Every song of this country has an unsung third stanza, something brutal snaking underneath us as we blindly sing the high notes with a beer sloshing in the stands, hoping our team wins. Don't get me wrong, I do like the flag, how it undulates in the wind like water, elemental, but best when it's humbled, brought to its knees, clung to by someone who has lost everything, when it's not a weapon. When it flickers, when it folds up so perfectly, you can keep it until it's needed, until you can love it again, until the song in your mouth feels like sustenance. A song where the notes are sung by even the ageless woods, the short grass plains, the Red River Gorge, the fistful of land left unpoisoned. That song that's our birthright, that's sung in silence when it's too hard to go on. That sounds like someone's rough fingers weaving into another's. That sounds like a match being lit in an endless cave. The song that says, my bones are your bones, and your bones are my bones. And isn't that enough?
Up this morning with my mom,
And it was
stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mom, stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mom, stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. I was walking and talking with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. I was singing and praying with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Singing and praying with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Singing and praying with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Oh, I woke up this morning with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mom, and it was stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Okay, that sounds good. Good stuff. Woke up this morning.
Now, let's take a moment to engage in the practice of generosity together. For those of you able to make a financial contribution, the logistics are on your screen. We invite you to either copy down the information you need or simply go to the website to make a donation. The web address is in the chat. Those of you who are newer or visiting from another part of the country may not be aware that we typically give away all of the cash from our Sunday offering to local charities whose missions align with our values, a program called the Month of Sundays. This month, the recipient is the Inland Oasis and Westside Food Pantry. If you are donating online, you can choose Month of Sundays from the drop-down menu. If you are mailing or dropping off a check, simply indicate on the memo line, whether it is intended for the month of Sundays or a general fund. In the spirit of love and for the continuing work of this church, we will now take some time to practice generosity together.
We come now to the time for meditation. Relax and take a deep breath. Let the many thoughts of the day fade away and listen. The spoken words will be followed by a brief time of silence and then music.
These are the words of the poet Amanda Gorman. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colours, characters and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious. Not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright.
This reading is from the book we read last month.
Hey, you guys, Leah here. So I must be among millions, if not billions of people who tuned in to the inauguration yesterday on January 20th, 2021. And I was inspired by every moment of it, but especially wrapped and lifted, exalted, just completely fixated and moved by Amanda Gorman's poem, her presence, her beauty, her artistry. And so this song was born. There is always a light when we are ready to see it. There is always a light when we are ready to be it. To see the light, to be the light, to raise our eyes in the dark of night, to climb this hill, together we will. There is always your light in the dark. We are ready to see it. There is always your light in the dark. We are ready to be it. To see the light, to be the light, to raise our eyes in the dark of night and be a gift. Together we will. There is always your light. There is always light. We are ready to see it. There is always your light. There is always light. We are ready to be it. To see the light, to be the light, to raise our eyes in the dark of night and be a gift. Together we will. There is always light. There is always light. There is always light. There is always light. To see the light, to be the light, to raise our eyes in the dark of night and be a climb this hill. Together we will. There is always light. There is always light. There is always shine. There is always light. Be the light. Hey, you.
The reading is from the book we read this month. It's titled, You'll Never Believe What Happened to Lacey, and it was written by the late night comic and writer Amber Ruffin, along with her sister Lacey Lamar. It is a very funny book, but it is sobering and revealing about what white people say when no people of color are around. You shouldn't be surprised that the book is about racism and racist people. Here is a quiz from you from the book, so you'll know a bit about what Amber Ruffin is thinking. Do I want to talk about this stuff with you? Do most Black people? Answer, no, because it is a very big thing for us and a very little thing for you. Question 2, when you talk to us about this stuff, do we get to see exactly where you fall on the racism spectrum? Answer, yes. And that's stuff that cannot be unseen. Question 3, am I saying white people don't talk to Black people about race? Answer, no. I'm saying no one wants to relive their traumatic events with someone who may say it was all their fault, you know? Question 4, am I saying unless I'm at some event for this book, or I know you extremely well, I, Amber Ruffin, do not want to talk to white people about racist things that have happened to me? And I would even go so far as to say, I don't want to have discussions about race with white people. Answer, I don't think every Black person feels that way, but, and I can't stress this enough, I very do.
The UUCP Racial Justice Book Group has been meeting for more than 3 years. reading and listening to a wide variety of literature and nonfiction written by Black authors. We decided to focus on strong narrations and memorable stories in nonfiction as well as fiction to help us better understand experiences we haven't lived, what structural racism feels like to individuals, how it impacts the lives of Black families over generations. We rounded out our readings with a few podcasts and film. Our current reading list for spring is in the church newsletter, where you can find it online if you're interested. Since our group began meeting about 3 years ago, the pandemic started, George Floyd was murdered, and the country began a national reckoning on racism, which now seems to have retreated. It's clear that racism is entrenched and that learning about it, educating ourselves, is all the more important. The following videos are from 3 readers in our group, sharing part of what they've learned through our reading and discussion. They are Mary Jo Hamilton, Diane Prorak, and Nancy Nelson.
I too want to talk about a book by Isabel Wilkerson titled Caste: The Origins of Our Discontent. Ms. Wilkerson compares racism in America to the caste system in India and anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. She says that each relies on stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest ranked people at the bottom and to rationalize the severe protocols of enforcement. Caste is fixed and rigid. Race is fluid and superficial, subject to periodic redefinition to meet the needs of the dominant caste in the United States. The origins of this caste system go back to the Emancipation Proclamation and abolition. The ruling class, white European property-owning men, set out to secure their position as the highest caste by legislation and a rigid social system that ensured that free Black people would always be the subordinate caste. Segregation of schools, punitive requirements for voting, discrimination in housing, bans on property ownership, and prohibition on use of public institutions became justified by divine will. It's in the Bible. Presumed laws of nature. The Black race is genetically inferior. And reinforced throughout the culture by violent and punitive enforcement. As the U.S. began to experience waves of immigration, the middle class began to fill up with immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Poland, Asian countries, all clearly inferior to the ruling class, but definitely above the subordinate class. The caste system still continues today. We see it in the judicial system and incarceration rates for Blacks. We see it in police violence, longer and more punitive sentencing, voter suppression. How can this be? Inferior schools for Black kids, gun violence in inner cities, Blacks challenged in their own neighborhoods for no reason. Those in the subordinate caste who work to better themselves, to get an education, to use or develop talents that would allow them to rise in the caste system, are often shunned or put down by their new peers. As Ms. Wilkerson says, the elevation of others amounts to a demotion of oneself. Thus, equality feels like a demotion. So, in order to avoid the hate and violence triggered by challenges to the caste system, Black American parents tell their kids to be respectful, don't question authority figures, particularly white ones. Keep your hands in sight, mind your manners, don't rock the boat. They see the boundaries the caste system sets up and acquiesce to them to protect their children and their neighbors. There is no question that this caste system was created and is maintained by the white ruling class. The system damages not only Black Americans, but other minorities and society in general through higher costs in the court system and policing, higher incarceration rates, and demand for social services due to low economic status of those in the minority caste. Prevention of full participation of Black Americans in American culture keeps us all from a richer and more diverse world. You and I did not create this caste system, but we benefit from it and have a responsibility to actively work to dismantle it. How can we truly learn to see beyond the color of one's skin, to free ourselves of caste labels? As Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Black Americans are tired of rich white men calling the shots for how people are treated in our society. Our history should contain the stories of all Americans, not just white rich ones. Black lives do matter, and we all need to understand and support that. Educate ourselves to see all sides of the events that shape our culture. Be sure our children hear all the voices that participate in our society. Seek out opportunities to talk with people whose lives are different from ours. Above all, listen more than you speak. Be empathetic. Be kind.
Recently, there has been a movement claiming public schools are indoctrinating students, when some schools are simply teaching the true history rather than the whitewashed history. I was taught that whitewashed history in the white, well-funded, high-quality suburban schools that were the apparent reason my parents fled the big city. The Racial Justice Book Club has been providing me with an education I never received, showing me the truth about past U.S. history and white privilege. The many books we have read and discussed have been eye-opening and helped me see some hard truths. However, 2 books in particular have been really mind-blowing. Both by Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, are books that revealed chasms in my education. The Warmth of Other Suns is about the Great Migration, a time from 1915 to 1970 when Black families moved out of the Jim Crow South seeking better treatment and opportunities after living in near-slavery conditions. The book follows 3 families, one of whom went to Chicago from Mississippi. I grew up in the white Chicago suburbs, part of the white flight out of the city. It's hard for me to admit the racism I grew up with. Relatives complained about the expanding Black population and their supposed lack of motivation and ability to improve their status. After all, they said, our ancestors had come here from Poland with nothing and worked their way up into the middle class. So why couldn't African Americans, they didn't use that term, pull themselves up by their bootstraps? But I had no idea of the history or experience of Black Chicagoans. I was never taught anything about the Great Migration. Here's some of what I learned from The Warmth of Other Suns. Black migrants uprooted themselves from family, friends, land, and climate to seek a place where they could improve their lives. And when they got there, many felt they had reached the promised land. However, and I quote, Black migrants confronted a solid wall of prejudice and labored under great disadvantages in these attempts to find new homes. The color line in Chicago confined them to a sliver of the least desirable blocks. New arrivals were often paid twice the rent charged to whites they had just replaced for worn-out and ill-kept housing. Thus began a pattern of overcharging and underinvestment in Black neighborhoods that would lay the foundation for decades of economic disparities in the urban North. Lodgers were not disposed to complain about the living conditions or the price charges. Migrants were sealed off in overcrowded colonies that would become the foundation for ghettos that would persist into the next century. So, while new Black residents had escaped the Jim Crow laws of the South, they hadn't escaped unspoken Jim Crow practices. There were many places that were off limits to Blacks, even beaches. These were defined by whites who saw the migrants as competition for jobs and resources. Once, a young black man floated into the, quote, white water in Lake Michigan, and an invisible line that extended out from a beach that was considered whites only. White boys threw rocks at him, and he drowned. When blacks asked for justice, a riot ensued. And I quote, "Contrary to modern-day assumptions, for much of the history of the United States, riots were often carried out by disaffected whites against groups perceived as threats to their survival. Thus, riots would become to the North what lynchings were to the South, each a display of uncontained rage by put-upon people directed toward the scapegoats of their condition. Each outbreak pitted two groups that had more in common with each other than either of them realized. Both sides were made up of rural, small-town people who had traveled far in search of the American dream, both relegated to the worst jobs by the industrialists who pitted one group against the other. Each side was struggling to raise its families in a cold, fast, alien place far from their homelands. They were essentially the same people, except for the color of their skin, and many of them arrived into these anonymous receiving stations at around the same time, one set against the other and unable to see the commonality of their mutual plight." So I had never learned any of this history. And this brings me to the second book, Caste, which examines the caste system in India, Nazi Germany, and compares racial divisions in this country to those systems, arguing effectively that the U.S. has a caste system. This book also explains current political behavior that I could not understand before. While Caste opened my eyes to many structural injustices and showed how the dominant caste manipulates society to hold power, I want to focus on a section that relates to my experience growing up in Chicago as a descendant of immigrants. And I quote, "Colonists made decisions that created the caste system long before the arrival of the ancestors of the majority of people who now identify as Americans. Each new immigrant, the ancestor of most current-day Americans, walked into a pre-existing hierarchy, bipolar in construction, arriving from slavery, and pitting the extremes in human pigmentation at opposite ends. Each new immigrant had to figure out how and where to position themselves in the hierarchy of their adopted new land. Oppressed people from around the world, particularly from Europe, passed through Ellis Island, shed their old selves and often their old names to gain admittance to the powerful dominant majority. Somewhere in the journey, Europeans became something they had never needed to be before. They went from being Czech or Hungarian or Polish to white, a political designation that only has meaning when set against something not white. To gain acceptance, each fresh infusion of immigrants had to enter into a silent, unspoken pact of separating and distancing themselves from the established lowest caste. Becoming white meant defining themselves as furthest from its opposite, black. They could establish their new status by observing how the lowest caste was regarded and imitating or one-upping the disdain and contempt, learning the epithets, joining in on the violence against them to prove themselves worthy of admittance to the dominant caste. In 1951, some 4,000 Italian and Polish immigrants went on a rampage when a black veteran tried to move his family into the all-white suburb of Cicero, Illinois. Hostility towards the lowest caste became part of the initiation rite into citizenship in America. Thus, people who had descended from Africans became the unifying foil in solidifying the caste system." End of quote. So sadly, I now understand why my ancestors abandoned their rich Polish heritage so that future generations like mine would assimilate into whiteness. Through the book club, I've learned more actual history and tried to develop my empathy and understanding of those who don't have white privilege, with the hopes of unifying groups that don't realize how much they have in common.
One of our book group members, Zoe Cooley, looked back at the many books we read and discussions we've had, and this is what she found. As we read, listen, and think, we gain increased understanding and some level of empathy. Yet we whites must acknowledge that
deeply as we learn to care and acknowledge the level of racist mistreatment in our society, we can never fully know the Black experience. That centuries-long experience created a lived reality which whites can identify with only up to a certain point. Empathy, yes, but major behavioral change is essential. Now, the question is, what changes do we need to make? How do we do that? What can we, living in towns that are so white, do to begin to right the wrongs perpetrated against Black people? Our book group has found there are things that everyone can do. The first is to look through someone else's eyes. This is harder than it sounds, and I don't think you can do it all by yourself. I found that there are many talented, amazingly talented Black authors who can help with this. With their help, I've learned that an ordinary experience that I take for granted as a white person can have many layers of history, creating anxiety for a Black person, layers that I would never see myself. Here's an example. Take the experience of a child flying unaccompanied on an airplane. When our white daughters flew alone, they didn't have to worry about representing other white families. They could just be themselves. But when fictional 11-year-old Delphine flew with her two younger sisters in the book, One Crazy Summer, written by Rita Williams Garcia, Delphine spent most of the flight monitoring and controlling her younger sisters to prevent them from attracting attention that would reflect badly on Black kids. She couldn't avoid the attention of well-meaning white passengers who wanted to treat the girls as if they were adorable Black dolls. While this airplane trip was fictional, it had the sting of reality to it. And I realized that almost every Black family I've seen shopping or eating out on the Palouse probably has worried at one time or another, what will the white people think if my kid acts up? It turns out that fiction in books, movies, and television is a remarkably effective way to see another person's point of view. But I need to emphasize, it's another person's point of view. If the fictional character you're going to read or watch is very different from yourself, different background, another culture, a different skin color, you are giving yourself an opportunity to see what life is like for another person. So here's something you can do now. Seek out books, movies, and TV shows featuring people who are different from yourself. The second thing we learned is that we need to learn about things you don't know. That would be history, including uncomfortable and even horrific history that some people now think should be avoided or ignored. The book that I learned the most from was The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. Many of us in the book group keep pointing back to that book. It taught me why so many Black people left the South between 1915 and 1970. They left cruel employers, counties without justice, and a place where they often were treated as less than human. And where they landed in the North was far from perfect. The neighborhoods and cities where I've lived were occupied by white people or Black people based on lines drawn by banks and lenders, redlining. Because I know about this history, I know that the houses Black people have been able to buy and the places they live are based on white choices. When you learn uncomfortable history, it changes the way you see the present. Right now, people in Pullman are having conversations about whether Thomas Jefferson's portrait should be displayed in the city library and if it's appropriate to have an elementary school named after him. I can feel how my attitude toward Jefferson is changing as I read more about the horrible reality of slavery. I used to think of Jefferson with great regard, admiring his humanistic writings and his gardens. But what are gardens when there were people not treated as people and forced to tend those gardens? Now, I would never choose to call a school Jefferson, and as long as the name remains, we need to talk about Jefferson's history. Be the change you want to see in the world, we tell ourselves. I say try it with the help of Black authors.
There's so much to learn and many opportunities to grow. For us, and the UU denomination. We invite you to seek out ways to learn about people who are different from you, especially the experience of Black people all over the US and throughout our country's history. This winter and spring, the University of Idaho will be hosting a Black Lives Matter speaker series. Speakers will appear over Zoom and include New York Times columnist and author Charles M. Blow. It just so happens that 2 of Mr. Blow's books are on our book group's reading list this spring. You're also welcome to join our racial justice book group by emailing Nancy Nelson. We're happy to widen our circle. Our closing words are a proposed 8th Unitarian Universalist Unitarian Universalist principle that's being discussed in regional and national UU gatherings this year. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote that we are journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse and multicultural beloved community, by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions.
We extinguish this chalice that it might glow gently in our hearts. May it light our paths as we leave this place. May it guide our way until we are together again.